All right, this is take four. Welcome to Critical Weight Theory. And I've got a little odd bit of historical trivia for you. So imagine walking through a quiet cemetery in Middlebury, Vermont. The gravestones surrounding you belong to local families from the 19th century. Then suddenly, one marker stops you in your tracks. It bears an Egyptian marking, the ancient key of life, alongside a Christian cross. The inscription claims that the grave belongs to Amonher-Kepchef, the 2-year-old son of an Egyptian pharaoh who died nearly 3,900 years ago. So, if the inscription is entirely accurate, this would be the oldest death date recorded on any American gravestone. But, like so many stories involving ancient Egypt, the truth is considerably more complicated, and this is a prince maybe. So, according to local tradition, Amonher-Kepchef lived around 1885 to 1883 BC. He's said to have been the son of 12th dynasty pharaoh Senusret III, sometimes rendered as Senwoset III, and Queen Hathor Hotep. And try pronouncing those names 3 times fast, especially if you're not familiar with the Egyptian language. But anyway, there's just one problem with all of this stuff that I've said so far. Egyptologists have never confirmed that such a prince actually existed. In fact, Egyptologists may dispute both the identification of the child as Amonher-Kepchef and the 1883 BC date on the headstone, as those claims originated from 19th century assumptions rather than confirmed archaeological evidence. So, yeah, the plot thickens already. The name Amonher-Kepchef, which roughly translates as Amun is with his strong arm, is much more characteristic of Egypt's later New Kingdom than the Middle Kingdom, at least from from what I looked up. And that was when Senusret III ruled. Likewise, no reliable historical evidence confirms that Senusret III and Hathor Hotep had a child by that name. In other words, the identity engraved on the Vermont headstone rests more on 19th century assumptions than on established archaeology. And that might lead this to be viewed with some skepticism, right? And that uncertainty, on the other hand, hasn't stopped the story from capturing imaginations. So I do have to clear up some confusion. If you've watched an animated film called The Prince of Egypt, you may actually recognize the name of Amonher Kepchef as one of Moses' nephews. And apparently, I haven't seen this movie, but apparently the character says the line, "Father, it's so dark, I'm frightened." So, it could be a powerful emotional moment in the film or whatever. And I'm not that familiar with the film's expanded universe, but that fictional character should not be confused with the mysterious child buried in Vermont. It's technically a different name. Um, you know, uh, there may have been multiple people with a name like that. So this gets more into some issues like grave robbery and that sort of thing, which also makes it a complicated story. So, how does an alleged Egyptian prince end up in rural New England? Unfortunately, the answer begins with yes, apparently grave robbing. Sometime during the 19th century, the mummy of a small child, possibly excavated illegally from the royal cemetery at Dashur, entered the thriving antiquities trade. Like countless Egyptian artifacts of the Victorian era, it passed through dealers in Europe and eventually reached the United States. Exactly how it reached Vermont remains surprisingly unclear. So you get actually multiple stories here, which adds to the fun of trying to get to the truth of this bit of trivia. So one account says that in 1886, someone named Henry Sheldon, who was a founder of the Henry Sheldon Museum of Vermont History. He purchased the mummy from Spanish sailors visiting New York City. Although that might not be correct, because another version claims that Sheldon bought it from New York coin and stamp dealer Edward Froissart for the modest sum of $10. Although $10, it was worth more money back then, surely. Both stories appear in online sources, and no definitive documentation has settled the question, at least based on what I could find out. And whatever the truth, the tiny mummy eventually arrived in Middlebury. But instead of becoming a museum attraction, it suffered an anticlimactic fate. At least originally, the remains were already in terrible condition. Rather than placing them on public display, Sheldon quietly stored the mummy in the museum attic, where it sat largely forgotten for nearly 60 years, to be discovered later, or rediscovered later, I should say. And the plot thickens yet again. In 1945, museum curator George Mead made an unexpected discovery while going through that attic. He found the deteriorated remains of the Egyptian child. Well, that's a tough sentence to say. Deteriorated remains of the Egyptian child. It's another tongue twister, I guess. A unique sentence, to be sure. And Mead faced an unusual dilemma. He believed the child deserved a respectful burial. At the same time, he worried that if the fragile mummy were buried intact, curious college students might dig it up as a prank. You know how those college students are. They can be, just completely disrespectful. They might be drunks. They might urinate in the street, as I've actually seen a college student do once. So this guy was, this I guess this Mead guy, if I remember the name correctly, he wasn't far off the mark in not trusting what might happen to this child if it was left displayed. So his solution was one that few people would anticipate. He cremated the remains in a neighbor's furnace. Just, hey, could I use your furnace to cremate a mummy that I have kept? Um, so the ashes were then interred in the Mead family plot at West Cemetery in Middlebury, thousands of miles from the Nile Valley, and the child finally came to rest among ordinary Vermonters. And is that what they're actually called, Vermonters? That doesn't sound right, but I guess maybe that is correct. But anyway, it's a very unusual gravestone, too. The gravestone itself is fascinating. The original inscription read, Ashes of Amonher Kepesh F, uh, age 2 years, son of Senwoset, third king of Egypt, and his wife Hator Hotep, 1883 BC. So today, researchers generally caution visitors that the information should not be taken as pure historical fact. The death date is almost certainly incorrect, and the prince's identity remains unverified, and who knows what they actually have in there. Yet the symbolism carved into the stone tells its own remarkable story. The Egyptian Ankh, the ancient symbol often interpreted as the key of life, appears alongside a Christian cross. It represents two vastly different religions, two different traditions meeting in one quiet Vermont cemetery. I was almost going to say cemetery. But anyway, some people actually make a pilgrimage to this place. Over the decades, the grave has become something of a local landmark. Visitors apparently often leave small gifts like coins, toy cars, tiny animal figurines, and it's a little bit sad. You might even see some humor in it. But obviously, this little baby, this baby mummy, if you will, it wouldn't even know what a car was or a truck. So, but these people, you have to kind of uh, understand their sentiment here. They're just trying to be nice to this little infant child, and simple. These are simple tokens of remembrance for a child who may have lived nearly 4,000 years ago, or perhaps for an unidentified Egyptian child whose true name has long since been forgotten. So it's a deeply human response, and I kind of respect that. And interestingly, this isn't unique. I've got another similar example of such a thing. There was another child remembered in a similar way across the Atlantic. Another ancient child's grave has inspired remarkably similar behavior. At Woodhenge, a prehistoric monument near Stonehenge in Wiltshire, England, archaeologists have they excavated the crouched remains of a young child buried during the early Bronze Age, somewhere between roughly 1760 and 1670 BC. So the burial was discovered during excavations led by Maud and Ben Cunnington between 1926 and 1928. And today, visitors routinely leave pennies, pebbles, hair bands, and other small trinkets upon the child's grave. Why I said trinkets oddly. These are like a bunch of tongue twisters to me or something, I swear. But anyway, archaeologists have observed that these offerings effectively transform the burial into what some call the tomb of the unknown child. So it's similar in spirit to the other place in Vermont. And people who have no connection whatsoever to this child nevertheless feel compelled to acknowledge the existence, or I guess you might say, the former life of the child. It's an extraordinary example of empathy surviving across thousands of years. And the same instinct appears to happen there that you'd find at the Vermont grave. Whether visitors believe the prince's story or not almost seems beside the point. The offerings aren't really for royalty, they're more for the child. They don't really care the class background of this infant. And the story of Amanher Kepeshev sits somewhere between archaeology, folklore, museum history, and Victorian fascination with ancient Egypt. We don't know the child's real identity. We don't know with certainty where the mummy originated. We don't even know exactly how Henry Sheldon acquired it. But we do know what happened afterward. A forgotten mummy in an attic became a respectful burial, an unusual gravestone became a local curiosity, and an anonymous child from ancient Egypt, whoever they truly were, continues to receive visitors nearly 4 millennia after their death. So that's an interesting story, I think. Sometimes history isn't just about certainty, sometimes it's about the stories that we tell, the mysteries we preserve, and the compassion that we extend to someone whose name and perhaps even their identity has been lost to time. And that's pretty remarkable if you think about it. So I butchered some names here and there. I goofed up a few sentences and individual words, but hopefully you like this episode and you feel compelled to subscribe um, and all that kind of stuff. And let me know your thoughts on this strange story. All right, that's about it. Have a good day.